Summer 1943. A young German soldier named Hans Schmidt steps off a train somewhere in rural Texas. He is a prisoner of war, captured in North Africa after Rommel's Afrika Korps collapsed. The journey from the battlefield to America took weeks, first to a processing center in North Africa, then by ship across the Atlantic, then by train deep into the American heartland. Hans expects to find a nation struggling under wartime rationing. Back in Germany, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had assured them that America was weak, that the British blockade had crippled German industry, but that Germany's enemies were suffering just as much. The Americans, Goebbels said, were soft, undisciplined, and lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a long war. Hans believed it. Most German soldiers did. Then he sees the camp. Clean barracks, electric lights, running water, medical facilities. And beyond the wire, a highway filled with civilian cars. Not military vehicles, not trucks commandeered for the war effort. Private automobiles, dozens of them, driving past the camp as if gasoline wasn't rationed at all. Hans stares in disbelief. One of his fellow prisoners mutters, "Mein Gott, we've already lost the war, haven't we?" Welcome to one of World War II's most fascinating untold stories. The shock experienced by over 400,000 German prisoners of war when they discovered the true scale of American industrial power. This is the story of how German soldiers, raised on propaganda about American weakness, came face to face with a nation that could fight a two-front war while its civilians still drove to the movies on weekends. Hit that subscribe button, because today we're exploring how America's industrial miracle shattered the Nazi myth of American decadence, one stunned German POW at a time. To understand the Germans' shock, we need to understand what they'd been told about America. Nazi propaganda had spent years painting a specific picture of the United States. According to Goebbels and his propaganda machine, America was a nation in decline, weak, divided, corrupted by capitalism and racial mixing. The German Wehrmacht, the most modern, mechanized military in the world, had nothing to fear from American industrial capacity. This wasn't just propaganda for home consumption. German military planners genuinely underestimated American industrial potential. When Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, many in the German High Command considered it almost irrelevant. America was thousands of miles away, separated by an ocean. By the time they mobilized and built up their forces, Germany would have already won the war in Europe. German soldiers internalized these messages. They knew America was rich. Propaganda couldn't completely hide that. But they believed American wealth made Americans weak. They thought Americans couldn't endure hardship, couldn't make the sacrifices necessary for total war. The reality was exactly the opposite. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, the United States didn't just mobilize, it transformed its entire economy overnight. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for the arsenal of democracy, and American industry responded with a production surge unprecedented in human history. Consider these numbers. In 1941, American factories produced 4,052 aircraft. By 1944, they were producing over 96,000 aircraft per year. Tank production went from 4,052 in 1941 to 29,497 in 1943. Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that carried supplies to Europe, were being built so fast that one shipyard launched a complete vessel in just 4 days and 15 hours. But German soldiers didn't know any of this. How could they? Goebbels controlled all information. German newspapers didn't report American production figures. German soldiers fighting in North Africa or Italy had no idea that American factories were outproducing the entire German industrial base by ratios of 3-1, 5-1, sometimes 10-1. They were about to find out. The first wave of German POWs arrived in America in 1943, mostly soldiers captured in the North Africa campaign. Rommel's Afrika Korps had surrendered en masse in May 1943, over 250,000 Axis troops, including roughly 125,000 Germans. The British couldn't house them all. Britain was a small island, already crowded, dealing with rationing and bombing. So they made a deal with the Americans. We'll send the prisoners to you. America had space, resources, and most importantly, the prison camps would be thousands of miles from any potential rescue or escape that might threaten Allied operations. The first shock for many German POWs was the journey across the Atlantic. They traveled on Liberty ships or converted troop transports, the same vessels that carried American soldiers to Europe. Even as prisoners, the food was better than what many had been eating in North Africa. Regular meals, fresh water, medical care for the wounded. Some German soldiers thought it was a trick. Surely the Americans were fattening them up for some sinister purpose. They couldn't believe prisoners would be treated this well. The ships docked at American ports: Norfolk, New York, Boston. German POWs marched down gangplanks onto American soil and saw something they'd never expected: a nation utterly untouched by war. No bombed-out buildings, no rubble in the streets, no civilians digging through ruins. The cities were intact, vibrant, bustling with activity. Shops were open. People were well-dressed. Cars filled the streets. Remember, these men came from a Europe that had been at war for 4 years. Germany itself was starting to feel the strain. Rationing was severe. Bombing raids were increasing. Every German city bore scars from Allied air attacks. And that was in Germany. In France, Italy, Poland, and across Eastern Europe, the destruction was apocalyptic. But here was America, untouched, thriving, fighting a two-front war against Germany and Japan simultaneously, and the American home front looked like nothing was wrong at all. The German prisoners were loaded onto trains, clean, modern trains with comfortable seats, and shipped to camps across the American interior. They crossed a continent, staring out windows at a landscape that seemed to mock everything they'd been told. Endless farmland, all cultivated, modern machinery working the fields, towns and cities passing by, all intact, all bustling with activity. Factories with smokestacks belching smoke, not from Allied bombing, but from round-the-clock production. One German officer, interviewed after the war, recalled, "We traveled for 3 days across America by train. 3 days, and everywhere we looked, we saw farms, factories, cities, all working, all producing. And I realized this nation could lose 10 times what we have and still not be defeated." Over 500 POW camps were established across the United States during World War II. They ranged from small camps holding a few hundred men to large installations housing over 3,000 prisoners. The locations were deliberately scattered: Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, even as far as the remote corners of Montana and the deserts of New Mexico. The Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment of prisoners of war, and America generally followed these rules. But German POWs quickly discovered that the American standard of humane was far beyond what they'd expected. The barracks were clean, heated in winter, and cooled by ventilation in summer. Each prisoner received a bunk with a mattress, not a luxury, just standard. There were communal bathrooms with hot water for prisoners. The food shocked them most of all. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same rations as the captor nation's troops. In America, that meant 3 substantial meals a day. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, bread, coffee, and fruit. Lunch and dinner featured meat, vegetables, bread, butter, and dessert. German POWs were eating better in American prison camps than German civilians were eating at home. Better, in many cases, than German soldiers at the front were eating. Letters sent home, carefully censored but still allowed, caused confusion and sometimes disbelief among families in Germany. "Papa says he has gained weight," one woman wrote in her diary. "How can this be? He is supposed to be a prisoner." The camps had recreational facilities, sports fields where prisoners could play soccer, craft workshops where they could learn skills or pursue hobbies, libraries stocked with books, some in German, some in English for those who wanted to learn. Musical instruments were provided, and German POWs formed orchestras and theater groups. Some camps even had beer halls, serving a weak 3.2 beer that was legal under American wartime regulations. German prisoners could gather, drink beer, sing songs, and for a moment almost forget they were in a prison camp. But here's what really broke their understanding of the war. They were put to work. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work as long as the work wasn't directly related to the war effort. America desperately needed labor. Millions of American men were in uniform, creating massive labor shortages. So German POWs were contracted out to farms, lumber camps, food processing plants, and other civilian industries. They were paid for this work. Not much, 80 cents per day in camp currency, but they were paid. They could use this money in the camp canteen to buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other goods. The canteen was stocked with items that had disappeared from German stores years ago. German POWs worked on American farms and saw agricultural mechanization they couldn't believe. Tractors that could plow a field in hours that would take days with horses. Combines that harvested grain at incredible speed. Irrigation systems that turned desert into cropland. They worked in lumber camps and saw forests being harvested with motorized equipment. They worked in food processing plants and saw industrial food production on a scale that didn't exist in Europe. And everywhere they worked, they saw waste. This might have been the most shocking thing of all. In Germany, everything was rationed, recycled, reused. Waste was unthinkable. But in America, they saw food scraps thrown away that would have been treasured in Germany. They saw equipment discarded because it was slightly obsolete, not because it was broken. They saw abundance so overwhelming that Americans could afford to be wasteful. One German prisoner working on a farm in Kansas recalled, "The farmer had 3 tractors. 3. In Germany, a village would share 1 tractor between all the farms. This one American farmer had 3 for himself." Another, working in a canning factory in California, wrote, "We produce more food in 1 day at this factory than my entire village in Germany would see in a month. And this is just 1 factory. There are hundreds like it." The psychological impact was devastating. As months passed and more German POWs arrived in America, eventually totaling over 400,000, a consensus began to emerge among the prisoners. Germany had already lost the war. Not because of any single military defeat, not because of superior Allied tactics or courage, but because of simple mathematics. The numbers were overwhelming. Some German POWs, especially officers and educated prisoners, began doing calculations based on what they observed. If one American farmer with 3 tractors could produce enough food for hundreds of people, how much food could all American agriculture produce? If one factory in California could process tons of food per day, how much could all American factories produce? If Americans were driving private automobiles when gasoline should be strictly rationed for military use, how much oil production capacity did America really have? The conclusions were inescapable and terrifying. Germany couldn't compete. Germany couldn't win. The disparity in industrial capacity was so enormous that no amount of German discipline, tactics, or courage could overcome it. Some examples of what German POWs witnessed. They saw American military units training with equipment that was then loaded onto ships and sent to Europe or the Pacific, and then new equipment would arrive to replace it. The production pipeline never stopped. In Germany, every tank, every plane was precious, carefully maintained and repaired. America treated military equipment as disposable. They saw American civilians complaining about rationing, but Americans' rationing was a joke compared to German standards. Americans were limited to 3 to 4 pounds of meat per week. Germans were getting a fraction of that. Americans grumbled about gasoline rationing that still allowed them to drive. Germans hadn't seen civilian gasoline in years. They saw construction projects that boggled the mind. New factories being built, military bases expanding, roads being paved, all while fighting a 2-front war against Germany and Japan simultaneously. One particularly observant German officer, George Gertner, later wrote about his experience. "We thought we were prepared for America. We thought we understood industrial warfare. We were children playing with toys. America was operating on a scale we couldn't even imagine." The younger prisoners, especially those who'd been indoctrinated in the Hitler Youth, struggled the most with this cognitive dissonance. They'd been taught their entire lives that Germans were superior, that the Aryan race was destined to rule, that Germany's enemies were weak and decadent. But here was undeniable evidence to the contrary. How could the weak Americans produce all this? How could the decadent democracy outproduce the efficient Nazi state? Some prisoners refused to accept reality. They insisted it was all a trick, an elaborate deception. Surely these weren't real factories. They were empty buildings, stages set up to fool prisoners. Surely these goods weren't real. They were imports, borrowed, stolen from conquered territories. But as time passed, this denial became impossible to maintain. Too many prisoners saw too much. The evidence was overwhelming. Letters from home, those that got through, painted a picture of increasing desperation in Germany. Cities being bombed, food shortages worsening, the front lines collapsing. Meanwhile, the prisoners in America were gaining weight, learning new skills, and watching American production surge ever higher. There's a poignant moment captured in several POW interviews. Different prisoners, different camps, but the same realization. We understood, finally, why our officers always told us we had to win quickly. Because if the war became about production, about resources, about who could build more tanks and planes and ships, we had already lost. One of the most interesting aspects of the German POW experience was their interaction with American civilians. The Geneva Convention prohibited forced labor, directly supporting the war effort, but there was always demand for agricultural and industrial workers. German POWs were contracted out to farms, lumber operations, and food processing facilities across America, particularly in rural areas suffering acute labor shortages. For many American civilians, particularly those in rural communities, this was their first direct contact with the enemy. The results were often surprising. In small farming communities across the Midwest and South, German POWs worked alongside American farmers. The Germans were often shocked by the informality. American farmers treated them not as defeated enemies, but as hired workers. They ate lunch together. They shared water breaks. Some farmers even invited German prisoners into their homes for meals. One German POW working in Louisiana recalled, "The farmer's wife gave us lemonade and cookies during our break. She treated us like humans, not like enemies. I couldn't understand it. We were bombing her cousins in Europe, and she was giving us cookies." American civilians were often equally surprised. The propaganda they'd consumed portrayed Germans as fanatical Nazis, goose-stepping automatons loyal to Hitler. Instead, they met young men, often teenagers, who were homesick, scared, and increasingly disillusioned with the Nazi regime. Not all interactions were positive, of course. Some communities resented the presence of enemy soldiers on American soil. There were protests in some areas. Some American service members, particularly those who'd lost friends or family in combat, were enraged that German prisoners were safe in America, while Americans were dying overseas. But overall, the program worked surprisingly well. German POWs provided crucial labor at a time when America desperately needed it. American civilians generally found that individual Germans were less frightening than the propaganda had suggested. And German POWs got an unfiltered view of American society that completely undermined Nazi ideology. The POWs saw American racial dynamics, which were complex and often troubling. Segregation shocked many German prisoners who found it hypocritical that America fought against Nazi racial ideology while maintaining its own racial hierarchy. Some German POWs were treated better than black American soldiers, a shameful reality that highlighted America's own moral failures. But they also saw American prosperity that was distributed far more widely than in Germany. They saw working-class Americans with automobiles, radios, and decent housing. They saw a middle class that was large and growing. They saw social mobility that didn't exist in the rigid class structure of Germany. Most surprisingly, they saw democracy functioning even during wartime. There were elections in 1942 and 1944. Political opposition to the president was not only allowed, but openly expressed in newspapers and radio. Critics of government policy weren't arrested or shot, they were debated. This was perhaps the most subversive thing German POWs witnessed, a democracy that was more efficient, more productive, and more resilient than the totalitarian Nazi state. As 1944 turned to 1945, the situation became clearer and clearer to German POWs in America. They read carefully censored news, both American newspapers and German POW camp newsletters. The censors removed details about military operations, but couldn't hide the big picture. Germany was losing, and losing badly. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Western Front was collapsing after D-Day. German cities were being bombed around the clock. And all the while, German POWs in America watched American production continue to surge. Some statistics that emerged after the war would confirm what POWs had intuited. From 1941 to 1945, America produced 297,000 aircraft,
which Germany produced 119,000. 86,000 tanks, which Germany produced 46,000. 2 million military trucks, which Germany produced 345,000, and 5,200 major naval vessels, which Germany produced 1,200. But raw numbers don't capture the full picture. What shocked German POWs was the ease with which America achieved this production. It wasn't desperate, all-consuming effort like Germany's total war economy. America was producing these numbers while maintaining civilian living standards that were the envy of the world. German POWs working in American factories saw production lines that ran 24 hours a day, with 3 full shifts of workers. They saw quality control measures that would reject items for minor defects. In Germany, anything functional would be rushed to the front. They saw automation and mechanization that didn't exist in German industry. One German engineer, a prisoner, who worked in a manufacturing plant in Ohio, later wrote, "I had studied engineering in Berlin. I thought German engineering was the finest in the world. Then I saw American mass production. We were craftsmen making expensive individual items. They were manufacturing on a scale that made quality almost irrelevant because they could afford losses." By the time the war ended in May 1945, most German POWs had reached the same conclusion. Germany never had a chance, not once America fully mobilized its industrial capacity. The Nazi propaganda about American weakness had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. America wasn't weak. It was the strongest industrial power in human history. American civilians weren't soft. They'd made sacrifices while maintaining living standards that would be luxury in Germany. American democracy wasn't inefficient. It had mobilized faster and more completely than Nazi totalitarianism. America's industrial might wasn't propaganda. It wasn't an exaggeration. If anything, Nazi propaganda had understated it. And once America fully mobilized that industrial power, Germany never had a chance. Those 400,000 German prisoners of war learned a lesson their leaders never did. You can't fight mathematics. When one nation can outproduce another by ratios of 3-to-1, 5-to-1, or 10-to-1, ideology doesn't matter. Courage doesn't matter. Superior tactics don't matter. Eventually, numbers win. They'd laughed at American softness while marching through France. They'd dismissed American industrial capacity as Jewish lies and enemy propaganda. They'd believed in German superiority right up until they stepped off trains in Texas, Kansas, and California. And then they saw the truth, and the truth was absolutely overwhelming. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe. Until then, remember that history has lessons for those willing to listen, and I'll see you in the next one.